Welcome to our evening service. We're going to take a break from our series on ecclesiastical separation for our communion service tonight. We're going to go back to Psalms. So Lord willing, we'll be back to that other series. We are going to look at Psalm 114 tonight. Psalm 114. Psalm 114. We will begin reading first eight verses of the Psalm. When Israel went out of Egypt, and the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, Judah was his sanctuary, and Israel his dominion. The sea saw it and fled. The Jordan was driven back. Mountains skipped like rams, little hills like lambs. What ailed thee, O thou sea, that thou fleddest, thou Jordan, that thou wast driven back? Ye mountains that skip like rams, and ye little hills like lambs? Tremble, thou earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of the God of Jacob. Turn the rock into a pool of water, the flint into a fountain of waters. A brief little psalm, but I think a fitting one to help us understand the Lord's Supper. A proper understanding, appreciation, and utilization of the Lord's Supper is progressively accomplished over time in each Christian's life and each local church's life. Most of us remember our first communion, and we're very limited in our understanding of what we were doing and why. But as time goes on and we repeat the Lord's Supper over and over and over, we begin to understand a little better of the cross of Calvary and the one who was there, and the Lord's Supper itself. Time for much meditation and exhortation. If you think back in your Christian life, and maybe as you began to think about the Lord's Supper, obviously it probably began in the Synoptic Gospels, right? As you began to think about what Matthew, Mark, and Luke had said about our Lord's death and about the Lord's Supper itself. Probably where it began. You began to say, oh, that's what they did, and this is what Jesus told us to do till he comes. And then repeated exposure to Paul's epistles of 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and especially for chapters 10 and 11 of 1 Corinthians. Personally and collectively, we got a better understanding of what the Lord's Supper means and how it's to be applied and how it's not to be done. And maybe somewhere pick up a little church history, which is also helpful. Knowing the difference between closed communion and open communion, or the theological terminology, even of views that are not right, transubstantiation, consubstantiation, and so forth. May or may not have ever heard of those, but many Christians pick that up somewhere along the line. And the different names that different churches call the Lord's Supper, communion, remembrance, Eucharist, and so forth. So as we move through our Christian life and relive that moment when the Lord's Supper was instituted, we grow in our understanding, hopefully, by the repetition. Personally, for myself, the bread and the cup and the Lord's Supper, what really opened it up to me over anything else like that was its connection with the Passover meal and the significance of the Jewish Passover. That was paramount for me, a major help personally of understanding what the Lord's Supper is and why we need to observe it. And when you realize that it was Passover bread and Passover wine that Jesus took to at the first Lord's Supper, first they ate the Passover supper, and then they ate the Lord's Supper with the bread and the wine from the Passover meal. Tonight I'm going to add another dimension to that. Some of you may know, or maybe know vaguely, but probably some of you do not know. It's said, and you may have noticed this, but the significance of it you may never have grasped, that Jesus and the apostles sang together the night that communion was introduced. Matthew tells us that, and so does Mark, and they basically say exactly the same thing. So we see it specifically recorded in the Gospels. In Matthew 26:30, it says that it basically says after the Passover meal and after the Lord's Supper, they sang a hymn of praise. And then they went out to the Garden of Gethsemane. Mark 14:26 says the same thing. If you look at the order of the text, that after singing a hymn of praise, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So the picture of that evening is that they ate the Passover meal, and then they had the Lord's Supper, and then they sang. So we know what the little group did that night. And usually we focus on that. Let's ask ourselves this question. What did they sing? Well, they sang a hymn. Is there any indication of what that hymn was? Well, Amazing Grace had not been written yet. They didn't sing that. Power in the Blood had not been written yet. So we know they didn't sing that. Redeemed How I Love to Proclaim It had not been written yet. So none of those songs that often we associate with the cross had been written yet. Now, the text in Matthew and Mark doesn't say specifically what they sang. It just says they sang a hymn. But we can make an educated guess with great probability of what they sang. Not 100%, but great probability. There, we are in Psalms, and in Psalms 113 to 18 is called the Egyptian Halal. It was sung, these particular Psalms were sung at different holy days, and especially Passover. So it was the Halal Psalms were written after the Babylonian captivity. This wasn't written by David. This came into the Bible after, not long after David's time, but also long after Jesus's time. And there's different Halals in the Bible. I'm not going to get into that. There's the Great Halal. That's another part of Psalm somewhere else. But this is called the Egyptian Halal. It's called the Egyptian Halal because our psalm mentions the coming out of Egypt. Psalm 114. I'm going to read D.A. Carson commentary on Matthew and the text that's pertinent. The hymn normally sung was the last part of the Hallel, Psalm 114 to 18 or 115 to 18. It was sung antiphonally. Now think about this. It was sung antiphonally. Jesus, as the leader, would sing the lines, and his followers would respond with hallelujah. Now that's interesting. Parts of it must have been deeply moving to the disciples when after the resurrection they remember that Jesus sang words pledging he would keep his vows, Psalm 116, 12 to 13, and ultimately triumph despite his rejection, Psalm 118, and call the nations to praise the Lord and his covenant love, Psalm 117. Fascinating stuff. You can get that in your head. Jesus is leading the group. He's leading it. And as the leader, he would sing the lines first, and then the apostles would respond. What must have been going over in their minds and hearts as they were doing that? Have you ever been in a church service when it's a particularly moving moment, particularly important time, and maybe you're singing "God be with you till we meet again" because somebody's leaving and going somewhere? They even put that in a World War II movie, right? Big, not a movie, it was a historical movie with parts in it. I forget the name of it, but they singing that a lot because they weren't going to see each other again. To me, I find it fascinating, this whole business of what is called the Egyptian Halal and the words that were sung and the thoughts that may have been going on at that moment. Because these are the things the other Jews would have been singing that night. Walter Wessel, in his commentary on Mark, said that it ended with the singing of the second part of the Hallel, Psalm 115 to 118. And one of those is 116:3. The cords of death entangled me. The anguish of the grave overcame me. I was overcome by trouble and sorrow. Can you imagine Jesus singing that as he's getting ready to go out and die? Or how about Psalm 118, 14 to 17? I will not die but live, and I'll proclaim what the Lord has done. I mean, I'm telling you, there's just stuff in here that if you think about these Psalms, the Egyptian Halal, and what it is, it's kind of amazing, really. Now, that's the last part. Matthew and Mark talk about them singing a hymn after the Passover and after the Lord's Supper. Did they sing anything before the Lord's Supper? Was there any singing commonly done before the Passover meal, and therefore before the Last Supper? The answer is yes. William Graham Scroggie said of Psalm 114, our psalm, this is the second of the Hallel Psalms, which are 113 to 18, and with Psalm 113, Psalm 114 was sung before the Passover. So 113 and 14 were done to prepare them for the Passover meal, and in this particular case, prepare them for what we call the Last Supper. And Kylan Dalich said of Psalm 14, it's the festival psalm of the 8th Passover day in the Jewish festival. So now, obviously, the Hallel Psalms were sung at other festivals as well. I'm not going to get into that. But it's interesting to me, absolutely fascinating to me, that Psalm 114 was closely associated with Passover week and closely associated with the night in which Passover meal was eaten by the disciples and that the Lord's Supper was given. So when I read Psalm 114, I am expecting something special. I'm expecting something significant. And I believe that we will see it. In fact, Psalm 13 and 114, there were 4 cups of wine were sung before the second cup, which was a cup of deliverance in the Passover meal. And it was celebrating the exodus of the Jews out of Egypt. Now, I know I'm giving you a lot of information. You probably won't retain all of that. I'm not sure I will retain all of it. But let's look at our psalm itself. And Bible teachers of many stripes have said that Psalm 114 has 4 stanzas of 2 verses each. That's kind of easy to divide it then. 4 stanzas of 2 verses each. And let's just make some initial observations as we start going through. I'm going to give you an outline later. Let's look at verse 1 and 2. When Israel went out of Egypt, the house of Jacob from the people of strange language, Judah was his sanctuary and Israel his dominion. Now that's astounding. The house of Jacob and Israel are parallel thoughts, and Judah and Israel are parallel thoughts. And so they're standing for the same thing. Now we know in history, Judah could stand for the southern tribes and Israel for the northern tribes. But in this particular case, it's just two different names for the same group of people. It's a variation like House of Jacob is in the earlier part, and Judah and so forth. So let's just think through this and work through it a little bit. And we see in verse 1 something very fascinating. We see what they were redeemed from, and in verse 2, what they were redeemed for. This is my outline. I'm just making an observation. When Israel went out of Egypt, and the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, the Greek Septuagint calls it barbarous, something like that, and it's a barbarous language. In other words, they didn't understand it. They had to live with people they couldn't understand their language, except for Moses, because he was learned and God kind of prepared him for what he had to do. So when Israel went out of Egypt and the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, that's what they were redeemed from. What were they redeemed to? Judah was his sanctuary and Israel his dominion. Again, each of those terms refer not just to the south and the north, but the whole nation. The point is that they would be a sanctuary for God, a holy place in the holy land. Now, the holy place is God's tabernacle and temple, but a holy God lives in a holy place in the holy land. Judah was his sanctuary and Israel was his dominion. That's referring to the theocracy. So God was dwelling in his tabernacle and temple, and it was the one place in the whole world where he was doing that. No other nation was a theocracy in the Old Testament. There was just one, a nation that had specific and unique privileges because of their redemption out of slavery, out of Egypt. No other people had ever had a privilege like that. And so verses 1 and 2 are talking about the going out of Egypt and where they were from and what God did to get them out, and then why he did it. They might be a sanctuary and that they might be his dominion. And so in this psalm, God's doing something. He's with them. And God's mighty presence is leading them out of Egypt. They're not going out on their own. They are being led by the Shekinah cloud. And Bullock said Israel's story of redemption from Egypt is the story of God taking up residence among his people, and thus is a microcosm of our story, Christ dwelling with us and ultimately in us. So it's a poetic account of Israel's obtaining a redemption from Egypt to the promised land. That's what you got in these first two verses. And it prefigures a greater redemption for the church. Redemption then was through power and blood. Our redemption at the cross was through blood and power. But then the theocracy was only in Israel. Alexander McLaren said the great fact about the Exodus was that it was the birthday of the nation, beginning of its entrance into its high privileges. Now remember, the Halal Psalms were written after the Babylonian captivity. And so people that had been in Babylon were brought out from Babylon, much like they were brought out from Egypt. And these Psalms were written lately to remind the nation of their identity, which they had forgotten, which caused the captivity in the first place. We forget our privileges. We forget our position. We forget who we are. We forget who God is. We forget what he's done. And this psalm is to remind us who God is, what he has done, and who we are because of it. William Scroggie said the sovereign Lord of all creation was the deliverer of his people millenniums ago and still is the deliverer of his people. And Arno Gaebelein, and Steve just gave me an autobiography of Arno Gaebelein. Didn't even know one existed. Read a biography of him, but that was a doctoral dissertation, but I didn't know there was an autobiography. And he said on Psalm 114, as his blood redeemed people, they became his sanctuary and his dominion. Now, let's stop back and look at the interesting poetry here. Everybody remarks on this psalm, bold poetry. This is really interesting poetry. I'm not a poet or the son of a poet, but I enjoy poetry when it's done well done, even though I don't understand it most of the time. Did you notice in verse 1 and 2 the word his? What's unusual about that? I'll read it. When Israel went out of Egypt and the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, Judah was his sanctuary and Israel was his dominion. What's unusual about that word here, his? You got a pronoun. Who's the pronoun referred to? It doesn't say. Where's the nearest antecedent to that? Not before it. He's just using the word his. He's not using the word Lord. He's not using the word God. He's not using any name for God. God is unnamed. He's just the unknown his in the poetry. Now, the reader, when he reads that, is going to, in his mind, say, well, I know who that is. But the poet holds off. And God is not mentioned specifically till verse 7. It's very interesting poetry. Only people who are poets understand this kind of stuff. And so an original reader who didn't know much about any of this would probably ask the question, who is his? Who is this his? Well, the following verses tell us who he is, but they still don't mention it. It's talking about some amazing, unparalleled events that happened when the Exodus happened. Notice in verse 3 and 4, second stanza. I'll read 1 and 2. When Israel went out of Egypt and the house of Jacob from a people of strange language, Judah was his sanctuary and Israel was dominion. The sea saw it and fled. What sea was that? Red Sea, Yam Suf. The Jordan was driven back. The sea saw it. That happened when they crossed the sea and it parted. They were out of Egypt. When they crossed the Jordan, they were into the promised land. But they didn't use boats and they didn't swim. The sea saw it and fled, and the Jordan was driven back. That doesn't happen every day. In fact, it's never happened except then. And so, what a fascinating thing that is. And it says the mountains skip like rams and the little hills like lambs. What's that refer to? That refers to Mount Sinai in the book of Exodus, chapter 19, and all the earthquakes going on there and the trembling of the mountains. So this is interesting. So they crossed the sea to get out of Egypt, and they crossed the Jordan River to get into the promised land. And then they have these earthquakes at Mount Sinai, and they're not only Mount Sinai, but the surrounding mountains and hills. So that was a dramatic redemption from over 400 years of national bondage, and a dramatic reaction to the redemption and to the Redeemer, from inanimate creation to that dramatic redemption. A thought came into my mind to try to illustrate this. If you get on YouTube, there's a bunch of videos that will make you pretty upset at the human race. It's the Queen's Guards in England, which I guess will be the King's Guards now. But those are professional soldiers. Those are professional combat infantrymen. They're trained in battle. I know they're dressed up in funny suits and stuff. But there's all these tourists trying to go up and take advantage of it. And either try to make them laugh, or they have no sense of where they are. This kind of embarrasses me from Americans, other people. And if you get on YouTube, you will see times where the Queen's Guards are marching, they just run over people. You're supposed to have some kind of recognition for where you are. These are the Queen's Guards. And they push you out of the way, or they just march right over you. And a lot of people got punched, right? Knocked out. Because they're just doing stupid stuff. And you remember the sayings that the individual guard will say when someone's in the front of them, or a bunch of them? Make way for the Queen's Guards. That's what they say before they run over you or push you aside. Or they'll take a step towards you and say, make way for the Queen's Guard. And if you don't make way, you're going to be laying on the concrete. Now, what I see here with this business of the Red Sea and the Jordan River and the mountains quaking is inanimate creations making way for the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the Creator of the world and the Redeemer of Israel. The inanimate creation knows who the Redeemer is, that it's God Himself. That's fascinating, isn't it? Creation is bowing to the Creator, Redeemer. Creation is making way. Creation's not like those stupid tourists doing what they do. It's a dramatic redemption, and there's a dramatic reaction from inanimate creation to that dramatic redemption and that dramatic Redeemer, and to those redeemed. So he's reminding us that the Redeemer of Jacob is the Creator of the universe, and the universe recognizes His presence and authority. The inanimate universe. What a dramatic thing that is. And then the poet goes on, and there's an interrogation, and a dramatic interrogation of the sea and the river and the mountains and the hills. And he's asking questions. It's an interrogation. What ails you, O sea, that you fled? Thou Jordan, that you were driven back? You mountains that you skipped like rams, and you little hills like lambs. It's an interrogation, a cross-examination. It's fascinating poetry, isn't it? It's beyond fascinating. Charles Haddon Spurgeon said of this psalm, true poetry has here reached its climax. No human mind has ever been able to equal, much less excel, the grandeur of this psalm. Now, just think about the poet who wrote this. How would you get this in your head? How would there has to be a deep reverence for God and a deep reverence for who He is and what He has done, and a theological background that's now put into play as this poet begins to think about these things and write them not as history or prophecy, but as poetry. So what's going on with the Red Sea? make way for the King of Kings and his people. You insult the queen's guards, you insult the queen. You insult the king's guards, you insult the king. If you have respect for the king or the queen, you will have respect for the guards that represent them. The nation of Israel was representing them. So that's why the Red Sea opened, because God opened it, but itself, in the poet's mind, it made way. And that's why the Jordan made way. And that's why the mountains made way in recognition. It's obvious, isn't it, that it's the Creator involved in the book of Exodus? Real God, real Redeemer. Eric Kidner said, well, G. Campbell Morgan said, nature recognized God's presence and obeyed his will. Eric Kidner said, here is the Exodus, not as a familiar item in Israel's creed, but as an astounding event. As startling as a clap of thunder and as shattering as an earthquake. So poetry is meant to create a response, right? It's meant to create a response in your soul, emotionally and spiritually. And we're to say something like this: the Redeemer of the Jewish nation is the master of the created universe, because he is. And that reminds me of the deep theology of Colossians 1. What is Colossians 1 but a recognition that Jesus is the creator? All things were made by him and for him. Without him, nothing was made. John chapter 1. Whether you're in John's theology or Paul's theology, the New Testament recognizes as the creator became our Redeemer. And isn't that what you have in the Last Supper? Bullock, a psalm writer, said the sheer literary and theological beauty of this psalm is enough to put every reader in awe of God's majestic work in history, and that is the writer's purpose. He wants to develop reverence and awe of the Exodus event. Here is a redeemer and a redemption that the created sea and rivers and mountains and hills recognize. And the whole point, again, is shall inanimate creation recognize it and we ignore it? James Montgomery Boyce, writing on this psalm, actually, I saw this after I had this in my head. He entitles it, Make Way Before God. Yeah, you caught it. You caught it. I thought I was getting something unique. No, because that's there. And he says here the triumph is not of God's people, but of God himself. Now there's a logical progression in this, and here's the outline of the psalm as I see it. In verses 1 and 2, we have redemption's event. When Israel went out of Egypt, the house of Jacob, from a people of strange language, Judah was his sanctuary, and Israel his dominion. In verses 3 and 4, we have redemption's effects. The sea saw it and fled. The Jordan was driven back. The mountains skipped like rams, and the little hills like lambs. So 1 and 2 is redemption's event. 3 and 4 is redemption's effects. And 5 and 6 is redemption's examination. If you look in 5 and 6, what ails thee, O sea, that you fled, thou Jordan, that you were driven back, you mountains that skipped like rams, and you little hills like lambs? Why did this happen? Why did this happen like this? It's because God is visibly revealing himself in this. This is not just between the Israelites and the Egyptians. And then finally, redemption's exhortation, verses 7 and 8. Tremble, our presence, the dome. Tremble, thou earth, at the presence of the Lord, at the presence of God. That's redemption's exhortation. Who turned the rock into a pool of water and the flint into a fountain of waters. Now, he's not calling for a little earthquake here. He's talking about a trembling, not of inanimate creation like the mountains and the hills, but of us. The word tremble here means a consternation, an anguish, a travailing. It's an awesome word here, really. It expresses terrible consternation. Tremble. One writer said, if the divine presence has such an effect on inanimate matter, how ought it to operate on a rational and accountable kings? We're to join the sea and the river and the hills. You know, if a man is seated and a woman enters the room, he ought to stand up, right? That's basic politeness. At a wedding, people say, when the bride comes in, all rise. People do that spontaneously, right? We know that's the way we should act at a wedding. In a courtroom, when the judge comes in, they always say, all rise, because there's some people dumb enough not to know what they ought to do in respect for human law. So in verse 7, there's an exhortation. Redemption's exhortation. This event at the Exodus should cause us to tremble. It should cause us to respect and honor and glorify the God of heaven. There should be an international trembling. When it says all the earth, it's not talking about the planet Earth, it's talking about the people of the earth. This whole thing is talking about everyone should respond to this, the Exodus. Now, by the way, some people did. Rahab started trembling, didn't she? And got saved. He heard about it. And it was an event that probably happened before she was born or when she was a baby. But she heard about it. They were still talking about it in Jericho. Because remember, they're 40 years in the wilderness. So she'd heard about the parting of the Red Sea as well as the parting of the Jordan River. So fascinating business. Trembling at God's might and majesty and God's mercy. You see how the psalm ends? This omnipotent God turned the rock into water or got water out of the rock so people could drink it. He's all powerful, but he is merciful as well. What kind of God is this? Isaac Watts, the hymn writer and poet, actually wrote about this. And since I'm not poetic and he is wonderfully poetic, I thought I would read this. This was written in 1712. It's all about Psalm 114. When Israel, freed from Pharaoh's hand, left the proud tyrant and his land, the tribes with cheerful homage owned their king, and Judah was his throne. Across the deep their journey lay, the deep divides to make them way. The streams of Jordan saw and fled, with backward current to their head. The mountains shook like frightened sheep, like lambs the little hillocks leap. Not Sinai on her base could stand, conscious of a sovereign power at hand. What power could make the deep divide, make Jordan backward roll his tide? Why did ye leap, you little hills, and whence the fright that Sinai feels? That's pretty good poetry, isn't it? Let every mountain, every flood, retire and know the approaching God. The King of Israel, see him here. Tremble, thou earth, adore and fear. His thunders and all nature mourns. The rock to standing pools he turns. Flint springs with fountains at his word. And fires and seas confess their Lord. Thank you, Isaac Watts. Now that word tremble, there's a cal imperative here. And it appears several times in the Bible. I want to work on this a little bit, and then we'll close. Turn with me to some places where it's used elsewhere. 1 Chronicles 16. 1 Chronicles 16. I want verse 30 where it's translated fear, but start in verse 26. For all the gods of the people are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. Glory and honor are in his presence, the strength and gladness are in his place. Give to the Lord, ye kindreds of the people. Give to the Lord glory and strength. Give to the Lord the glory due his name. Bring an offering and come before him. Worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. Fear before him or tremble before him, all the earth. The world also shall be stable that is not moved. So that's a fascinating exhortation there. Turn to Psalm 96:9. 96:9. You see the exact same imperative. 96:9. Oh, worship the Lord in the beauty of holiness. Fear or tremble before him, all the earth. All the earth. In Psalm 114, verse 7. Psalm 114, verse 7 is our verse. And then go back to Micah 4:10. Micah 4:10. Micah chapter 4 and verse 10. Be in pain and labor to bring forth, O daughter of Zion, like a woman in travail, for now shalt thou go forth out of the city, you'll dwell in the field, and now shall you go to even Babylon, there shall you be delivered, there the Lord will redeem thee from the hand of thy enemies. That be in pain is our word. Tremble, tremble, and labor to bring forth. It's often used of women in labor, by the way. It's used of someone who's wounded, used of someone who's in childbirth, be in pain. And lastly, this is not an imperative, but it's the same verb, Jeremiah 5:22. Jeremiah 5:22. I'm going to start reading in verse 19. And it shall come to pass when you will say, why does the Lord our God all these things unto us? Thou shalt answer him, as you forsaken me and serve foreign gods in your land, so shall you serve strangers in a land that's not yours. Declare this to the house of Jacob, publish it in Judah. Hear now this, O foolish people, without understanding, who have eyes and see not, and have ears and hear not. Fear ye not me, says the Lord. Do you not tremble at my presence? To place the sand for a bound of the sea by a perpetual decree, it cannot pass. And though its waves toss themselves, yet they cannot prevail. Though they roar, yet they cannot pass over it. Do you not tremble at your creator, this planet? It is an amazing thing. Now, this omnipotent creator is benevolent. He brought water out of the rock, so he's very powerful. He can bring Jews out of Egypt and a nation and bring water out of a rock, and the sea and the rivers made way for him, and the mountains and hills. Mark Futato, writing on Psalm 114, said this story was only a dress rehearsal. Were you ever in a play in high school? I was in a couple of plays. I didn't have any major parts or anything. Once I was in lighting, but once I had a little part, I never had a major part. But you have a dress rehearsal, don't you? Before the main thing. And Mark Futato said, this story was a dress rehearsal. You mean the Exodus was a dress rehearsal? It's not the main thing? It's a dress rehearsal in history. This story was only a dress rehearsal. The presence came in the person of Jesus Christ, John 1:14. with his coming, the kingdom would come. Matthew 12:28. And he's still found to be a benevolent king for all who find protection in him. You know the problem? At the first coming, the nation didn't tremble. Psalm 114 in their Bible, celebrating the Passover in their midst. It was Passover week when they crucified him. It's like, can you observe these things and talk about these things and have some understanding of these things and miss the main point? How scary, isn't it? Have communion, we can have the Lord's Supper, somehow not get into it. Kind of shocked at the impiety and indecency and irreverence that they would lay their hands on God incarnate King. Well, with thinking about our psalm and the fact that Jesus probably sang this, apostles probably repeated it as a group to him in an antiphonal singing. Then they observed, or as they observed, the Passover. And then they had, and the Creator at the sea recognized, and the river, Jordan, mountains and the hills, sitting right, came to his own, and his own received. We're going to prepare ourselves for the Lord's Supper by singing the hymn, before we take. Were you there when they crucified? That's an African American spiritual that actually predates the Civil War. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Appeared the first time in an old plantation hymn book, 1899, but it very much dated that. So we're going to sing that, and it's in this, not in our normal red hymn book. It's in this praise red hymn book. See what I'm looking at? It's in this praise hymn book, and the number there is 228. There, when they